Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a curious corner of history. A place where the scent of sweat and cheap ale mingled with the faint, unsettling aroma of fear. Imagine yourself crammed into the Globe Theatre, the wooden planks beneath, your feet vibrating with the energy of 1,000 eager and often restless souls. The air is thick with anticipation, the stage alive with grand pronouncements and dramatic gestures. You're captivated by the tragedy unfolding before you. Perhaps Hamlet or Macbeth, the actors pouring their souls into every line. But as your gaze sweeps across the crowd, you notice something unsettling in the hands of a few disgruntled spectators. Not just empty tankards, but small, glistening red orbs. And suddenly, you realize, with a chill that has nothing to do with the evening air, that for the actors on that stage, those innocent-looking spheres held a terror far greater than the critic's sharpest words. You probably won't survive this journey into the peculiar perils of Elizabethan theatre without a new appreciation for modern audience etiquette. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You see, for us, a tomato is just a tomato, a perfectly innocent, plump, juicy fruit or vegetable, depending on who you ask. And we'll get to that juicy debate later, I promise. We slice it into salads, stew it into sauces, or, if you're really daring, bite into it like an apple. But step back into Elizabethan England, and this seemingly harmless red orb transforms into something else entirely. It becomes an object of suspicion, a symbol of potential illness, and, for the actors bravely treading the boards, a projectile of pure, unadulterated dread. Imagine being on that stage, bathed in the natural light of the open-air theatre, your voice echoing across the courtyard. You're performing your heart out, perhaps delivering a soliloquy, when your eyes snag on a flicker of red in the crowd. Your stomach clenches. Is it just someone's hat, or is it? It disposant about a bad review in the Times. Dispose about physical assault, a direct, squishy, and deeply humiliating form of public disapproval. The fear wasn't merely the sting of the impact, though that certainly wasn't pleasant. No, the terror was rooted far deeper, in the very beliefs and superstitions of the age. Historians still argue whether the Solanum lycopodium, as our humble tomato is scientifically known, truly originated in the Americas, or if some ancestral varieties existed elsewhere. What's certain, however, is that when it arrived in Europe, likely brought back by Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century, it was met with a hefty dose of skepticism. Unlike many other New World plants, which were quickly embraced for their culinary or medicinal properties, the tomato got off to a rocky start. It belonged to the nightshade family, a botanical clan that also included belladonna and mandrake, plants notoriously toxic, capable of inducing hallucinations, paralysis, or even death. This botanical kinship immediately painted the tomato with the brush of danger. It looked suspiciously similar to deadly nightshade, and in a time before widespread scientific understanding, appearances were everything. If it looked like poison, it probably was poison, right? A simple, understandable, if ultimately incorrect, deduction. So, when an Elizabethan audience member held a tomato, they weren't just holding a snack. They were holding a piece of suspected poison, a potential harbinger of disease, a literal rotten fruit with a dark reputation. And if you, as an actor, were deemed rotten, well, then the two rotten things might just meet in a most unpleasant collision. It wasn't just about a poor performance. It was about the collective anxiety surrounding unknown plants, the fear of the exotic and the unfamiliar. This fear wasn't irrational in their context. It was a deeply ingrained cultural response to a world still largely uncharted and full of genuine perils. The notion of simply eating a tomato for pleasure was, to many, utterly preposterous, bordering on suicidal. You might as well invite a plague doctor over for a casual chat about your spleen. So, you're standing there, playing your role. Sweat trickling down your brow, not just from the exertion of performance, but from the sheer anxiety of what might fly your way. The tomato's grim reputation wasn't born overnight, nor was it entirely unfounded in the eyes of the Elizabethans. Beyond its family ties to poisonous plants, there was another, perhaps even more insidious, reason for its distrust. Its perceived link to illness. Think about it. A fruit, soft and juicy, that rotted quickly, sometimes with mold. In an age before refrigeration and advanced food hygiene, the sight of a spoiled tomato could easily be associated with disease. People often mistakenly believed that what caused decay in food could also cause disease in the body. If it went bad quickly, it must be bad. This wasn't some fringe belief held by a few eccentrics. No, this was widespread. Tomato was often called the poison apple in some circles, a name that conjured images of tempting yet deadly fruit from biblical tales or local folklore. It was deemed fit only for pigs or, perhaps, the truly desperate, while other New World imports, like potatoes, which also had a hesitant start, but that's a story for another time, eventually gained acceptance. The tomato remained firmly in the suspect category for centuries in many parts of Northern Europe. There's a wonderful irony, isn't there, in how today we practically bathe our dishes in tomato-based sauces, while back then the mere thought would send shivers down an Elizabethan chef's spine. Imagine a farmer, perhaps trying to introduce this new crop, only to be met with wary glances and whispers of ill omen. It causes fevers. Someone might declare, it brings on the sweating sickness. Another might add, echoing the very real and terrifying epidemics that swept through Europe. The scientific method, with its careful observation and experimentation, was still in its infancy. Instead, people relied on inherited wisdom, superstition, and the occasional gut feeling, which, when it came to a strange red fruit, often screamed, "Stay away." This widespread cultural aversion meant that throwing a tomato wasn't just a random act of vandalism or a simple expression of displeasure. It was an act imbued with deeper meaning. It was, in a way, saying, "You are as foul and as dangerous as this rotten fruit." It was a public shaming, a declaration of disgust that resonated on multiple levels. It wasn't like tossing a crumpled program or a wadded-up flyer. This was personal, symbolic, and deeply insulting. You weren't just pelted, you were ritually condemned with a vegetable that most people already regarded with a healthy dose of fear. Historians still argue whether the actual toxicity of certain wild or unripened tomato varieties contributed to this initial fear, or if it was purely a case of mistaken identity due to its nightshade relatives. What's clear is that the perception was powerful, shaping public opinion and creating a genuine hazard for anyone unfortunate enough to be on the receiving end. One popular misconception was that the acidity of tomatoes caused lead poisoning when consumed from pewter plates, which were common among the wealthy. While true that acidic foods can leach lead, The tomato itself wasn't the source of the poison, but it certainly didn't help its reputation among the elite, who were the only ones who could afford such plates. So, when that squishy missile came flying, it wasn't just a physical assault, it was a cultural assault, a public declaration that you, the actor, were as unwelcome and potentially harmful as the poison apple itself. It was a potent combination of fear, superstition, and raw audience disapproval, all delivered in one messy, red splat. For the actor, it must have felt like being hit by a curse, a sign of truly terrible fortune, all while trying to remember your lines about a melancholy Dane. The indignity alone must have been almost as painful as the bruise itself. Beyond the peculiar terror of the tomato, you must understand that the Elizabethan stage was, in many ways, an occupational hazard waiting to happen. Forget your modern safety regulations, your padded sets, and your carefully rehearsed fight choreography. This was theatre by the seat of your pants, often with very little in the way of safety nets, literal or metaphorical. You're not just dodging tomatoes, you're navigating a minefield of potential mishaps. Imagine the stage itself, often a simple wooden platform, perhaps slightly elevated, exposed to the elements. Rain, wind, even a rogue gust could send a prop tumbling or make the stage dangerously slick. Then there's the lighting, or rather, the lack thereof. Performances were usually held during the day to take advantage of natural light, but even then, shadows could play tricks, and actors might easily misjudge a step. Night performances, when they occurred, relied on flickering torches or candles, casting dancing shadows that made the stage a perilous landscape of light and gloom. One misstep, one hurried entrance, and you could be tumbling into the audience pit, or worse, off the back of the stage. And the costumes, glorious, elaborate, and often cumbersome. Imagine trying to deliver a passionate monologue while encumbered by layers of heavy velvet, elaborate ruffs that restrict your peripheral vision, and perhaps a sword that keeps getting tangled in your cloak. Quick changes were a nightmare of pins, laces, and frantic wardrobe assistants. A mismanaged costume could trip you, snag you, or even, in the heat of the moment, lead to an embarrassing wardrobe malfunction that would surely delight the jeering crowd. Historians still argue whether costume quality was more about portraying status than practical performance. But you can bet practicality often took a backseat to spectacle. Then there were the props. Real swords clashing, not dulled stage versions. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, actors weren't always working with meticulously crafted, safe facsimiles. Sometimes, the props were real, dangerous objects. A mistimed thrust, a clumsy fall, and you could be dealing with genuine injuries. And don't forget the special effects, rudimentary as they were. Thunder was made with cannonballs rolled down a wooden chute. Lightning by flashing gunpowder. While effective, these pyrotechnic displays carried inherent risks of burns or accidental fires in a wooden theater packed with people. You were essentially working in a large flammable tinderbox, hoping no one got too enthusiastic with the gunpowder. And what about the sheer physical demands? Actors often played multiple roles in a single play, sometimes even within the same scene, requiring costume changes and shifts in character. The Elizabethan theatre season was grueling, with plays often performed daily, sometimes even twice a day. There was no extensive rehearsal period like today, no months to perfect your craft. You learned your lines, you blocked your scenes, and you performed. The sheer stamina required was immense. Imagine doing Shakespeare 8 times a week, battling dehydration, exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of a rogue fruit or a tripping hazard. It's enough to make your modern gym routine look like a gentle stroll in the park. So, while the image of a tomato-flinging audience member is iconic, it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle of peril. The actors of Elizabethan England were true risk-takers, not just artistically, but physically. Every performance was a high-wire act, a delicate balance between triumph and potential disaster, with very little in the way of safety nets or pre-show warm-ups. It was a tough gig, where survival on stage meant more than just remembering your lines. It meant avoiding a nasty splat, a twisted ankle, or perhaps even a fiery accident. Now, let's talk about the audience. Oh, the Elizabethan audience. You might imagine a hushed theatre, polite applause, and dignified gasps at dramatic reveals. Forget all of that. The Elizabethan audience was a teeming, rowdy, and often dangerous entity, a force of nature that could make or break a performance, and occasionally an actor's nose. You weren't performing for a polite crowd sipping artisanal lattes. You were facing a raw, unfiltered cross-section of London society, packed shoulder to shoulder, high on ale and low on patience. The social stratification was immediately visible. The groundlings, those who paid a penny, stood in the open-air yard directly in front of the stage, exposed to the elements and each other's rather potent bodily odors. Above them, in the galleries, sat the wealthier patrons, their seats offering a slightly more elevated and perhaps less pungent view. And in the Lord's rooms, sometimes even on the stage itself, sat the truly elite, flaunting their finery and their proximity to the action. This diverse mix meant a cacophony of expectations and behaviors. The groundlings often were there for entertainment, spectacle, and a good laugh, sometimes at the expense of the actors. They were quick to cheer and even quicker to jeer. Imagine the sheer noise. Not just polite murmuring, but shouts, catcalls, arguments breaking out, vendors hawking their wares, oranges, nuts, and yes, even questionable fruit that might double as projectiles. The globe wasn't a silent temple of art. It was a bustling marketplace of human emotion, a vibrant, chaotic hub where anything could happen, and often it did. If a play was boring, if a line was flubbed, if an actor forgot their place, the audience would let you know. Not with a polite cough, but with a chorus of boos, whistles, and the undeniable thud of an organic missile. This wasn't just about showing displeasure, it was about active participation. The audience felt they were part of the show, and their reactions were as much a part of the performance as the actors' lines. They didn't just passively consume, they actively engaged, expressing their approval with thunderous applause and their disapproval with a visceral, often messy, retort. Historians still argue whether this audience behavior was a continuation of medieval revelry or a new urban phenomenon born of London's burgeoning population. Regardless, it was a beast unto itself. Think about the sheer vulnerability of the actors. There was no fourth wall in the Elizabethan theatre. The audience was right there, close enough to smell your grease-spant, to hear your whispered asides, and to target you with unsettling precision. If you were a particularly unpopular character, or if you simply delivered a line poorly, you became an immediate target. It wasn't just the groundlings either. Even the more refined patrons in the galleries weren't above a well-aimed orange if the mood struck them. Remember, these were times when public floggings and bear baiting were popular forms of entertainment. A little light fruit tossing at a play was practically mild by comparison, so When you consider the Elizabethan actor, don't just picture them delivering poetic lines. Picture them also scanning the crowd, bracing themselves, perhaps subtly shifting their position to avoid a particularly irate patron. Every performance was a high-stakes gamble, not just for artistic success, but for physical well-being. The audience wasn't just a group of spectators. They were an unpredictable, sometimes hostile, collective force that held immense power over the stage. And that power, as you're starting to understand, often came with a side of squashed produce. So, you've grasped the inherent dangers of the stage itself and the volatile nature of the audience. Now, let's hone in on the core question. Why fear a tomato more than a critic's scathing words? For us, a bad review can sting, might impact ticket sales, or even damage a reputation. For an Elizabethan actor, a bad review was a minor annoyance, compared to the very real, very physical threat of public humiliation and injury. Critics back then didn't wield the same kind of systemic power we associate with them today. There weren't well-established newspapers with dedicated theatre reviewers, no online forums for instant, widespread condemnation. Instead, critics were often simply disgruntled audience members, rival playwrights, or even competing theatre companies. Their words, while potentially hurtful, were largely ephemeral. They might mutter a complaint, spread a rumor, or perhaps pen a venomous poem that circulated amongst a small group. But these critiques rarely had the immediate, visceral impact of a hurled vegetable. Think of it. A whispered insult might bruise your ego, but a squishy tomato to the face bruises, well, your face and your dignity. Consider the permanence of the act. Words, once spoken, dissipate into the air. A rotten fruit, however, leaves a tangible, undeniable mark. A stained costume, a bruised cheek, the lingering smell of decay. These were undeniable proofs of public disapproval. And in a society where public image and honor were paramount, such a visible sign of scorn was far more damaging than a few whispered complaints. It wasn't just about the discomfort. It was about the profound shame of being literally pelted with refuse, often by people of lower social standing. Historians still debate the extent to which verbal criticism circulated outside of elite intellectual circles. But the impact of a physical protest was undeniable for all to see. Moreover, the theatre experience itself was designed to be interactive, raw, and immediate. There was no polite separation between performer and audience. The groundlings were close enough to touch, to shout at, to literally interact with the actors. A critic's words might reach a few ears. A thrown tomato, however, was a broadcast message, seen and understood by everyone in the globe. It was a loud, messy, unmistakable declaration. We, the audience, are not pleased. And in a time when many actors were barely above vagrant status, in the eyes of the law, such public displays of contempt only reinforced their precarious position in society. It was a brutal reminder of their place. So, while today an actor might fret over a New York Times review, an Elizabethan performer's immediate concern was surviving the performance without being decorated in spoiled produce. The critical judgment that mattered most was the immediate, unvarnished, and often projector-laden opinion of the masses, packed into the globe. It was the difference between a paper cut and a punch to the gut. Both hurt, but one carries a far more immediate and impactful threat. You could ignore a critic's words, perhaps even laugh them off later over a pint of ale. But you couldn't ignore the splat of a tomato against your cheek, nor the roar of laughter from the crowd that followed it. It was a very physical manifestation of disappointment. Now, Let's get into the nitty-gritty, the messy physics of a rotten toss. What exactly went into a successful, from the audience's perspective, tomato strike? It wasn't just a random fling. There was a certain art to it, a blend of opportunity, anger, and a surprising amount of historical context. You're not just witnessing a spontaneous act. You're observing a cultural phenomenon, a primitive form of audience feedback, far more impactful than a modern-day tweet. First, you needed the ammunition. As we've discussed, the tomato was already viewed with suspicion, making it a perfect, symbolic projectile. But it also had practical advantages. It was relatively soft, meaning it was less likely to cause serious injury than, say, a rock, yet squishy enough to make a satisfying, noticeable splat. Imagine the crowd, perhaps during an intermission, as vendors circulated, hawking their wares. Among the oranges and nuts, some might have been selling particularly ripe, perhaps even slightly overripe, tomatoes. These weren't for eating, oh no, these were for expression. A shrewd vendor might even specialize in audience participation tomatoes, knowing full well their intended use. It's a cheeky thought, isn't it? A 16th century entrepreneur building a business on theatrical dissatisfaction. Then came the motivation. Displeasure could stem from a myriad of sources. Maybe the play was truly terrible, the acting abysmal, or the plot utterly confusing. Perhaps the actor playing the villain was particularly convincing, stirring genuine ire among the less discerning audience members. Or it could be something completely unrelated to the performance, a bad day at the market, too much cheap ale, or a personal grudge. Remember, this was a time when public displays of emotion were far less constrained. If you felt angry, you showed it. And if you had a squishy red projectile in your hand, you knew exactly what to do with it. The mechanics of the throw itself would vary. A groundling standing close to the stage might opt for a quick, underhand lob, aiming for maximum splatter. Those in the galleries, further away, would need more force, perhaps a vigorous overhand throw, hoping to clear the heads of those below and land their sticky protest on target. The aim wasn't always perfect, of course. Many a tomato likely missed its intended mark, instead decorating a fellow audience member or harmlessly splattering against the wooden stage. But even a near miss served its purpose, sending a clear message of discontent. Historians still argue whether the frequency of these fruit-throwing incidents was exaggerated in later accounts, or if it was truly a common occurrence. What's undeniable is the cultural memory of it, and the underlying tension it created for performers. This wasn't a one-off event. It was a known risk, a part of the theatrical landscape, and the knowledge that at any moment, a collective wave of disapproval could manifest as a volley of squashed produce must have added an extra layer of pressure to every performance. You could deliver the most heart-wrenching monologue, yet still be one bad line away from a sticky, public humiliation. It's enough to make you consider a career in, anything else, really. Perhaps even farming, just to get back at those pesky tomatoes. You're starting to get a clear picture of the pressure an Elizabethan actor faced, not just from their lines, but from the unpredictable human elements in the audience. And within that chaotic, theatre-going public, social standing played a fascinating, often thorny role in the act of tomato tossing. It wasn't entirely egalitarian. You see, the ability to throw a tomato, and to whom, was subtly influenced by the rigid class system of the era. Imagine yourself a groundling, paying your single penny to stand in the pit. You're rubbing shoulders with apprentices, laborers, perhaps even the occasional pickpocket. Your social standing is low. your voice often unheard in wider society. But here, in the theatre, you have a potent, if messy, form of agency. You can directly express your disdain for a performance, and the physical act of throwing something at a perceived social superior, an actor, even if low on the overall social ladder, was still a performer, set apart, carried a certain rebellious thrill. It was a brief moment of power, a tangible assertion of your opinion against someone who was, at least for the duration of the play, above you. Now, contrast this with the wealthier patrons in the galleries, or, God forbid, the lords and ladies, seated on the stage itself. While they certainly harbored critical opinions and might occasionally toss a piece of fruit, their motivations and methods were different. For them, open, messy displays of anger might be seen as uncouth. Beneath their dignity, a sneer, a dismissive wave of the hand, or a pointed departure might be their preferred method of showing displeasure. To physically throw a rotten tomato could be seen as lowering oneself to the level of the groundlings, potentially even risking staining their expensive finery. Historians still argue whether the upper classes engaged in fruit throwing with the same frequency as the lower classes, but the consensus is that it was primarily a groundling phenomenon, fueled by proximity and raw emotion. Yet, there was a peculiar paradox at play. While the act of throwing might have been more prevalent among the lower classes, the fear of being struck by a tomato might have been even more acute for actors playing noble characters, or those aspiring to higher social standing. To be splattered with the poison apple by a commoner was not just a physical indignity. It was a profound insult to one's artistic ambition and fragile social aspirations. It was a leveling act, a public declaration that, despite your silk costume and grand pronouncements, you were no better than the dirt beneath their feet, fit only to be pelted with garbage. It's enough to make you wish for a quiet life as a scrivener, doesn't it? Much less risk of getting covered in pulp. So, while the threat of the tomato hung over every actor, its social weight varied. For the actor, being hit by a tomato from a groundling was not just a physical discomfort, but a symbolic humiliation, a messy reminder of their precarious position in the intricate tapestry of Elizabethan society. It highlighted the power dynamic within the theatre, a temporary inversion where the common man held the power to literally deface the performer, even if that power only lasted for the length of a single, satisfying splat. Beyond the immediate threat of airborne produce, you must also understand that an Elizabethan actor's very existence, their ability to put food on their own table, hopefully not of the poison apple variety, hinged precariously on the patronage system. This wasn't a world of independent contractors and agents. This was a world where professional companies of actors literally couldn't exist without the backing of a powerful noble. You were, in essence, someone's glorified servant, and that dependency added another layer of anxiety to an already stressful profession. Imagine being part of a company like the Lord Chamberlain's Men, Shakespeare's own troupe, remember? Or the Admiral's Men. Your very legal standing depended on your association with a lord. Why? Because without a noble patron, actors were legally classified as vagabonds or vagrants, and the penalties for vagrancy in Elizabethan England were severe, ranging from whipping to branding, or even forced conscription into military service. So, while you might be performing before thousands, enchanting them with your wit and drama, a slip in patronage could see you summarily stripped of your livelihood and your freedom. It's enough to make you think twice about improvising that line, isn't it? This system meant that your patron's good graces were paramount. If the Earl of Leicester or Lord Hunsdon or whoever sponsored your company decided you were no longer amusing, or if your plays drew too much negative attention, your company could be disbanded overnight, and with it, your entire livelihood vanished. This put immense pressure on the actors and the company managers to keep their patron happy, to select plays that wouldn't offend, and to maintain a respectable or at least tolerable public image though. When a tomato came flying, it wasn't just about disappointing the crowd, it was about potentially displeasing your patron. A series of rowdy, tomato-laden performances could signal that your company was losing its appeal, that it was incapable of controlling its audience, or that its plays were too provocative. This, in turn, could lead your noble protector to withdraw their support, leaving you and your fellow actors literally out on the street, branded as rogues. Historians still argue over the precise role patrons played in daily theatre management versus simply offering legal protection. But their ultimate power over a company's fate was undeniable. The actors were essentially living on borrowed legal protection, performing under the umbrella of noble status. It was a fragile security, constantly at risk from public opinion, political machinations, and even the capricious whims of their patron. So, while critics' words might sting and a tomato might bruise, the ultimate fear was losing that crucial patronage, because without it, the stage wasn't just dangerous, it was an illegal, life-threatening pursuit. It truly puts a different spin on breaking a leg, doesn't it? It was less about luck and more about survival in a rather cutthroat, high-stakes game. So, you're an actor, dancing on the edge of vagrancy, dependent on a patron's whim, and now you realize that despite your growing fame, your social standing is surprisingly low. This is a crucial point in understanding why the tomato felt so much worse than a critic's quip. For all their popularity, Elizabethan actors occupied a rather murky, often looked down upon, place in society. You weren't a revered artist. You were closer to a traveling entertainer, often lumped in with minstrels, jugglers, and even beggars. Imagine the paradox. You might be performing for the Queen one day, captivating thousands with your portrayal of a king or a tragic hero, only to be considered little better than a common vagrant the next. The official view of actors was quite unfavorable. The church often condemned them as immoral, promoters of idleness and vice. Civic authorities viewed them with suspicion, seeing them as potential carriers of disease, especially during plague outbreaks, which, trust me, were not fun and as gathering points for unruly crowds. This is why the patronage system was so vital. It offered a thin veil of legitimacy, distinguishing a player from a common, sturdy beggar. This low social standing meant that actors, despite their onstage grandeur, were vulnerable. They didn't have the inherent respect or protection that came with being a nobleman, a wealthy merchant, or even a skilled craftsman. They were seen as transients, often without fixed homes, moving from town to town, their lives seemingly dedicated to frivolous entertainment. Historians still argue how much of this perception was rooted in genuine moral disapproval versus a fear of large, unruly public gatherings. But the outcome was the same for the actors, a precarious social position. So, when a tomato came flying, it was more than just an insult to your performance. It was a public reaffirmation of your perceived low status. It was a physical manifestation of the disdain many in society felt for your profession. It was a reminder that for all your talent and the temporary magic you created on stage, you were, in many eyes, still just a player, someone barely deserving of polite respect. let alone protection from airborne vegetables. It's like being a rock star today, but knowing that half the audience sees you as little more than a street busker. The applause might feel good, but the underlying vulnerability never truly goes away. You might be portraying a king, draped in sumptuous robes, uttering lines of profound wisdom, but the moment that squishy red projectile hit, all that illusion evaporated. You were just a human being, exposed and vulnerable, reminded of your tenuous grip on societal acceptance. This constant tension between onstage grandeur and offstage lowliness created a unique psychological burden for Elizabethan actors, making the immediate physical humiliation of a thrown tomato a far more potent and feared consequence than any whispered critique. Now that you understand the peculiar social tightrope an actor walked, let's peek behind the velvet curtains, beyond the stage lights, or rather the sunlight, and delve into the often harsh realities of an actor's daily existence offstage. This wasn't a glamorous life of limousines and private jets, not even close. You weren't a celebrity in the modern sense. You were a working professional in a demanding, often thankless, trade. Imagine the grueling schedule. As mentioned, plays were performed almost daily, sometimes even twice, especially during peak seasons. There was no dark day for rest and recuperation like in modern theatre. This meant constant rehearsals, memorizing new lines, and perfecting existing roles. A new play might be written and put on stage within a matter of weeks, sometimes days, demanding rapid learning and adaptation. There was no luxury of months-long workshops or method acting. You learned your lines, you hit your marks, and you delivered. It was a factory of dramatic output, relentless and unforgiving. Accommodation was often rudimentary. While successful companies might have a shared lodging house, individual actors often lived in cramped, shared rooms, sometimes even above alehouses, where the din of patrons below could easily disrupt any attempts at quiet study. Meals were likely simple, hearty, and often consumed on the go. There wasn't a personal chef waiting to whip up a gourmet meal after a long day of pretending to be a Roman emperor. Money, while better than that of many laborers, was not boundless. There were costumes to maintain, scripts to be copied, and, of course, the occasional bribe to be paid to local officials to ensure performances went smoothly. Travel, when a company toured, was another ordeal. Imagine packing up all the costumes, props, and personal belongings, then setting off on muddy, rutted roads, often on foot or in slow, uncomfortable carts. This wasn't a leisurely road trip. It was an arduous journey, fraught with dangers like highwaymen, bad weather, and the ever-present threat of disease. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, hygiene on the road was minimal, and the risk of catching a fever or a more serious ailment was constant. Historians still argue about the precise income levels of actors compared to other professions, but it's clear they worked hard for their shillings. Then there was the constant vulnerability to the law. Despite their patrons' protection, individual actors could still find themselves in trouble for various reasons: brawls, unpaid debts, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. London itself was a sprawling, bustling, but also dangerous city, teeming with petty criminals and a sometimes brutal justice system. An actor's offstage life was far from the glamour of the stage. It was a life of hard work, low social standing, constant travel, and genuine physical risks, all for the love of the craft and the necessity of earning a living. So, next time you see a period drama, spare a thought for the actor who, after A long day of being an eloquent duke was probably just dreaming of a quiet corner and a warm, tomato-free meal. Given the relentless pace, the precarious social standing, and the very real dangers actors faced, you might wonder who truly held the reins guiding these performers through their gauntlet. That, my friend, often fell to the playwrights. While actors were the face of the performance, the playwright was the architect. And they had an incredibly vested interest in keeping the audience happy, not just for artistic integrity, but for the protection of their own creations and the actors who brought them to life. Imagine being William Shakespeare, or Christopher Marlowe, or Ben Jonson. You've poured your heart and soul into crafting a magnificent play. Every soliloquy, every witty exchange, every dramatic climax is a product of your intellect and imagination. But your masterpiece is utterly dependent on the actors to perform it and the audience to receive it. If the actors are too frequently assaulted, if the audience consistently walks out, or worse, starts throwing things, then your play, no matter how brilliant, becomes a failure. It might even be pulled from the repertoire, never to see the light of day again. That's a pretty strong incentive to write something that keeps the groundlings engaged and their hands off the produce, so playwrights weren't just scribbling away in isolation. They were acutely aware of the audience's volatile nature. They would often structure plays with moments of high drama, physical comedy, or thrilling sword fights, all designed to capture and hold the attention of a notoriously fickle crowd. They had to balance intellectual depth with popular appeal, knowing that too much obscure poetry or too little action could quickly lead to boredom. And boredom, in the Globe, was a dangerous precursor to flying fruit. Historians still argue about the extent to which playwrights wrote to the audience versus expressing pure artistic vision, but the commercial pressures were undeniable. Furthermore, a playwright's reputation was tied to the success of their plays. If a play was a hit, they earned more, and their standing within the theatrical world grew. If their plays consistently flopped or incited riots, their career would quickly dwindle. They were essentially the project managers of a highly interactive, often unpredictable, live event. They had to anticipate audience reactions, manage actor capabilities, and even factor in the limitations of the stage itself. You could write the most spectacular scene involving a flying dragon, but if the stage mechanisms couldn't support it, or if it risked setting the theater on fire, it was a non-starter. Thus, the playwright served as an invisible shield for the actors, at least in theory. By creating compelling narratives and engaging performances, they hoped to preempt the audience's worst impulses. A truly captivating play could hold the crowd spellbound, making them forget the rotten tomato in their pocket, or at least reconsider throwing it. It was a subtle, psychological form of crowd control, far more effective than any bouncer, and certainly less messy. So, in a strange way, the playwright's quill was, perhaps, the ultimate deterrent against the dreaded poison, apple. You've seen how playwrights tried to control the chaos with their words, but even their genius couldn't prevent all the pitfalls of the Elizabethan theatre world. One particularly thorny issue that added layers of peril and intrigue for actors was the existence of a theatrical black market. This wasn't just about bad reviews or flying tomatoes. This was about stolen intellectual property, cutthroat competition, and rivalries that could turn genuinely nasty. Imagine putting weeks, even months, into rehearsing a new play, only for a competing company to get their hands on a pirated version of the script. This happened. Playwrights and acting companies meticulously guarded their scripts as they were their most valuable assets. But there was no copyright law as we know it today. If a rival company wanted to stage a popular play, they might send a shorthand reporter to the theatre to quickly jot down the lines during a performance. Or, more nefariously, they might bribe an actor to sell them their part, piece by piece, allowing them to reconstruct the entire play. This was known as creating a bad quarto, a notoriously inaccurate, often garbled version of the original. Why was this so dangerous for actors? Well, if your company's hot new play was suddenly being performed poorly, no doubt by a rival troupe down the street, it directly impacted your livelihood. Less unique draw for your theatre meant fewer patrons, which meant less money for the company and, ultimately, less pay for you. It also meant a dilution of the artistic product, potentially turning off audiences from the play altogether if they saw a shoddy version first. It was a direct threat to the financial stability of the entire company, including your very existence as an actor under a patron's protection. Furthermore, these rivalries weren't always confined to intellectual property theft. Competition between companies could spill over into genuine animosity. Actors from different troupes might engage in verbal sparring, or even physical altercations, especially after a few pints of ale. The streets of London were not always safe, and the theatre districts, bustling with people, were ripe grounds for such encounters. You weren't just performing, you were part of a competitive, often aggressive, business landscape where rivals played dirty. Historians still argue about the true frequency of these bad quartos and their exact impact on the theatre economy. But the concern among playwrights and companies was clearly significant. So, while you might be dodging tomatoes from an unhappy crowd, you also had to contend with the silent, insidious threat of industrial espionage. Your very performance, your carefully honed craft, could be stolen and bastardized, impacting your income and damaging your company's reputation. It added a layer of paranoia to an already nerve-wracking profession. It's enough to make you wish for a quiet life, perhaps running a small, out-of-the-way tavern, far from the prying eyes of rival spies and the ever-present threat of airborne produce. You've seen the internal struggles, the black market, the cutthroat competition, the precarious legal standing, but the Elizabethan theatre, by its very nature, was also a magnet for trouble that often extended beyond its wooden walls. Conflicts, whether between rival actors or disgruntled audience members, frequently spilled from the stage and into the teeming, chaotic streets of London. This added another layer of real-world danger to an actor's already eventful life. Imagine a performance has just ended. The crowd, a mix of groundlings, gentry, and everything in between, pours out of the globe. Emotions are high. Perhaps a heated argument over a play's plot or an actor's portrayal has simmered during the performance, and now, fueled by ale and the anonymity of the crowd, it erupts. To audience members, previously restrained by the confines of the theatre, now find themselves in a public thoroughfare, ready to settle their dispute with fists or even daggers. And an actor, just trying to make their way home, might suddenly find themselves in the middle of it. This wasn't uncommon. The areas around the theatres, particularly on the south bank of the Thames like Bankside, where the Globe was located, were bustling, sometimes rough, districts. They were hubs of entertainment, but also of vice and general disorder. Bear-baiting pits were nearby, brothels abounded, and taverns overflowed. These were places where tempers flared easily, and disputes were often settled not with polite debate, but with brawls. An actor, recognizable from their public performances, could become an unwitting target or even be drawn into a fight simply by association. It was like being a modern-day sports star, only instead of just dealing with aggressive fans, you might actually get challenged to a duel by them on the way to your car. Consider the journey home after a late performance, even if you escaped. The theatre unscathed by tomatoes, the dark, unlit streets of London presented their own set of perils. Robberies were common. Gangs roamed certain areas, and if you happened to cross paths with a disgruntled group who had just left the theatre, still fuming about your portrayal of a particularly hated character, well, you were in for a rough night. Historians still argue about the exact statistics of street violence involving theatregoers, but contemporary accounts certainly paint a picture of a lively, sometimes dangerous, urban environment. So, for the Elizabethan actor, the performance wasn't just confined to the stage. It extended into their daily lives, into the very streets they walked. Every day was a potential encounter with a disgruntled patron, a rival, or just plain bad luck. The threat of a tomato on stage was immediate and humiliating, but the threat of a street brawl, of physical harm away from the controlled environment of the theatre, was a more insidious, ever-present danger that could leave more than just a bruised ego. It's enough to make you consider simply sleeping on stage, isn't it? At least there, the dangers were somewhat predictable. You've traversed the treacherous landscape of Elizabethan theatre, from the poison apple tomatoes to the street brawls. But as history marches on, so too does society, and with it, the behavior of audiences. You see, the unruly, projectile-flinging crowds of Shakespeare's time didn't last forever. The evolution of audience etiquette, a slow, often begrudging process, began to shift the theatrical experience, making it, eventually, a much safer place for actors. Imagine the gradual tightening of social norms. As London grew, and as the middle classes gained more influence, there was a growing desire for more civilized forms of entertainment. The boisterous, often vulgar, nature of the public theatres began to be seen by some as unrefined. This wasn't an overnight transformation. Mind you, it was a slow chipping away at centuries of ingrained habits. The very idea of theatre moved, inch by painful inch, from a raucous communal event to something more akin to a polite, passive consumption of art. One significant factor was the shift towards indoor, purpose-built theatres, often lit by candles or oil lamps rather than relying on natural light. These enclosed spaces, while initially just as lively, fostered a slightly different atmosphere. The darkness encouraged a greater focus on the stage, and the closer proximity might have made public disruptions feel more acutely disruptive. More expensive seating further segregated the audience, with the wealthier patrons increasingly setting the tone for expected behavior. You couldn't just throw a half-eaten orange without risking the wrath of a powdered wig in the seat next to it. The rise of critical writing also played a subtle role. While not as immediate as a tomato, the development of more formal theatre criticism, especially in later centuries, slowly helped shape public taste and expectation. Audiences began to learn what constituted good and bad theatre from published reviews, rather than solely relying on their gut reactions and the contents of their pockets. This introduced a more intellectual, less visceral form of engagement. Historians still argue whether the formalization of theatre etiquette was a natural societal progression or a deliberate effort by theatre owners and elite patrons to control the unruly masses. Of course, the tomato itself slowly shed its fearsome reputation. As botanical knowledge advanced and culinary experimentation expanded, people began to realize that the tomato wasn't, in fact, a deadly poison. It migrated from a decorative garden curiosity to a culinary staple, first in southern Europe, then gradually spreading north. The poison apple became simply a delicious fruit, its dark past largely forgotten by the general public. So, by the time the theatres of London moved firmly into the Georgian and Victorian eras, the idea of throwing a tomato at an actor would have seemed not only barbaric, but also a terrible waste of perfectly good food. It's like imagining someone throwing a perfectly good avocado at a concert today. Utterly unthinkable. The theatre became less a bear-baiting pit with actors, and more a place for genteel appreciation. Save for the occasional shouted encore, so you've journeyed through the perilous stages of Elizabethan England, seen the terror of the poison apple, and watched as audience behavior slowly matured. Now, let's bring it full circle and witness the remarkable, almost poetic, redemption arc of the humble tomato. From a feared fruit of ill omen, it blossomed into the culinary cornerstone we know and love today. Imagine the sheer disbelief an Elizabethan actor, bruised and tomato-stained, would feel if they could glimpse our modern kitchens. They'd see refrigerators brimming with ripe, red tomatoes, jars of tomato sauce lining shelves, and pizzas glistening with their vibrant hue. The transformation wasn't a sudden revelation, but a gradual, quiet acceptance that began, surprisingly, in the very parts of Europe where the tomato first arrived, in Italy and Spain, particularly where the climate was conducive to its growth and where the fruit was less associated with deadly nightshade, perhaps due to different local varieties, or a less fearful cultural predisposition. The tomato slowly began its culinary ascent. It was initially used by the poorer classes, those who were less concerned with fashionable fears and more interested in finding affordable, nutritious food. Slowly, recipes emerged, incorporating the fruit into sauces, stews, and simple dishes. Its bright acidity and rich flavor were discovered and appreciated, especially when combined with other New World imports like chili peppers. Historians still argue about the exact timeline of the tomato's culinary acceptance across different European regions, but its southern European embrace was undoubtedly key to its global success. It was centuries after Shakespeare's time, well into the 18th and even 19th centuries, that the tomato truly shed its fearful reputation in Northern Europe and North America. Scientific understanding advanced, debunking the old myths about its toxicity. People experimented, tasted, and discovered its versatility. Farmers began cultivating varieties specifically for consumption, and as new recipes spread, the demand grew. The once feared poison apple became a symbol of hearty, delicious cuisine. Imagine the irony. The very thing that Elizabethan actors dreaded became a staple in the diets of their descendants. It truly gives new meaning to the phrase, "Oh, how the tables have turned." Today, the tomato is one of the most widely consumed fruits. Yes, it's botanically a fruit. In the world central to countless cuisines, its journey from being a suspicious, feared plant to an everyday ingredient is a testament to changing perceptions, scientific discovery, and the human palate's insatiable desire for flavor. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll look at that innocent-looking tomato on your counter with a newfound respect, knowing the long, strange journey it took to get there, and the very real fears it once instilled in the hearts of brave Elizabethan actors. The story now softens, the vibrant colors fading into the gentle hues of evening, as the echoes of bustling theaters and worried actors begin to recede. Let your mind drift from the curious dangers of the past. The wooden planks of the globe, once alive with drama and the occasional thud of a missed projectile, now stand quiet. In the moonlight of history, the fears of those long ago performers, their anxieties about flying fruit and fleeting fame, have dissolved into the vast tapestry of time. You are safe now, far removed from the clamor and chaos, held gently by the quiet of the night. All the grand performances, the whispered secrets, and the long, slow journeys across muddy roads are simply whispers on the wind, fading into the peaceful hum of your own quiet space. Allow your thoughts to grow soft, your body to relax deeply, and all the peculiar anxieties of history to melt away. There's only calm now, as the gentle rhythm of your breathing guides you towards a deep and restorative sleep.